Las Vegas has always been a city built on secrets. Beneath the neon glow and the promise of fortune, darker stories have unfolded. Stories of power, violence, and the men who shaped the city through fear and intimidation. This is the story of one such man. Anthony Spilotro, Tony the Ant, a 5'2" enforcer who cast a shadow far larger than his frame. The Chicago outfit sent him to protect their most valuable asset in the American West. Instead, he became the spark that burned their Vegas empire to the ground. His story is one of brutal ambition, strategic miscalculation, and the violent end that comes when you break the rules of the only world you've ever known. From the streets of Chicago to a shallow grave in an Indiana cornfield, Tony Spilotro's life changed Las Vegas forever. Not through his successes, but through his spectacular failures. This is that story. Chapter 1. Patsy's Boy. Chicago, 1938. The city was still reeling from the Depression, but for certain families in certain neighborhoods, opportunity came from places most people didn't dare look. May 19th. A boy was born to Italian immigrants on the west side. His parents named him Anthony John Spilotro. He was the fourth of 6 brothers, who would all grow up in the shadow of the family business. His father and mother ran Patsy's restaurant on Grand Avenue. To the average customer, it was just another Italian place serving good food at fair prices. But Patsy's was something else entirely. It was a meeting place, a spot where men with particular reputations came to conduct particular kinds of business. Young Tony grew up serving pasta to mobsters. He learned to recognize the faces of power before he learned to shave. The Chicago outfit wasn't just something he heard about. It was part of the wallpaper of his childhood. It was normal. The neighborhood was thick with outfit influence. On every corner, in every shop, the presence of organized crime was simply the way things worked. Protection money, gambling operations, loan sharking. These weren't abstractions for Tony Spilotro. They were the economic reality of his world. His brothers found different paths. Some stayed legitimate. Others found themselves pulled into the life. But Tony? Tony seemed destined for it from the start. By his teenage years, he'd already developed a reputation. Volatile, quick to anger, unafraid of violence. The worst combination for a young man growing up where he did. Or perhaps the best combination, depending on your perspective. Street muscle came naturally to him. Despite his small stature, Tony made up for it with an absolute willingness to escalate any situation to its most violent conclusion. When you're 5'2", you learn early that you can't afford to lose. You can't afford to back down. You have to be twice as mean as everyone else just to survive. And Tony Spilotro survived. By the late 1960s, he had graduated from street-level enforcement to trusted soldier status within the outfit. His reputation for intimidation had reached the ears of people who mattered, people who could give him real work, real responsibility. The FBI was already building files on him, the kind of files that followed certain men for their entire lives, files that documented a pattern of violence, of threats, of operations that generated cash and fear in equal measure. But in 1968, Tony wasn't worried about FBI files. He was worried about proving his worth to the organization, about moving up, about earning the kind of respect that came with serious assignments. He got married, started a family. To the outside world, he looked like any other working man trying to make his way in Chicago. But behind that facade, Tony Spilotro was becoming one of the Chicago outfit's most reliable enforcers. Reliable when it came to violence, anyway. That particular skill set was about to earn him the assignment that would define the rest of his short life. The outfit had a problem in Las Vegas. A problem that required someone with Tony's particular temperament. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect an investment was through fear. In 1971, they sent him west. Chapter 2. The Skim Protector. Las Vegas in the early 1970s was still very much a frontier town. Sure, it had the casinos and the glamour and the entertainers. But underneath all that shine, organized crime ran the show. The Chicago outfit, through a web of frontmen and shell companies, controlled several major casinos. The Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, the Marina. Together, these properties formed what was known as the Argent Corporation portfolio. Managing day-to-day operations was a man named Frank Rosenthal. Lefty, they called him. He was brilliant with numbers, brilliant with odds, brilliant at running a casino floor. But Lefty wasn't muscle. He was brains. The outfit needed both. The real money in Vegas wasn't coming from legitimate casino profits. Not entirely, anyway. The real money was in the skim. Before the official count, before the taxes, before anyone could track it, cash was diverted, skimmed off the top. Millions of dollars, flowing back to Chicago, funding operations across the Midwest. It was a beautiful system, as long as nobody disrupted it. That's where Tony Spilotro came in. His job was simple in theory. Protect the skim, enforce discipline among casino employees, deal with competitors who got too bold, handle thieves, intimidate anyone who might consider cooperating with federal investigators, keep the heat off the money. Tony arrived in Vegas and immediately set up shop. He opened a jewelry store and later a gift shop called the Gold Rush. These were fronts, legitimate businesses that explained his income and gave him a base of operations. But everyone in the Vegas underworld knew who Tony Spilotro really was. They knew he represented Chicago, and they knew that crossing Chicago meant dealing with Tony. The early years went relatively smoothly. Tony did his job, he kept the skim flowing, he dealt with problems before they became crises. For the outfit bosses back in Chicago, sending Spilotro to Vegas looked like a smart move. But there were warning signs, small things at first. Tony's temper, his tendency to escalate situations that could have been handled quietly, his growing taste for the spotlight. See, Tony was supposed to be invisible, a ghost who handled problems and disappeared. But Tony Spilotro didn't know how to be invisible. Everywhere he went, people noticed, sometimes because of his swagger, sometimes because of the violence that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Local law enforcement started paying attention. The FBI field office in Vegas added him to their watch list. The Nevada Gaming Control Board heard rumors. Nothing concrete yet, nothing actionable, but the whispers were starting. Tony was running a crew now, associates who helped him with various operations. Muscle when he needed it, guys who understood the life and were willing to do what needed doing. He was also making money on the side, sports betting, loan sharking, various other enterprises that weren't officially sanctioned by Chicago, but weren't exactly forbidden either. As long as the main job got done, the bosses didn't micromanage. For a while, Tony walked the line. He protected the skim. He kept the casinos running smoothly from Chicago's perspective. But he was also building his own little empire within Vegas, his own sphere of influence. That independence would eventually become a problem, a fatal problem. But in the mid-1970s, Tony Spilotro was riding high. He had power, he had respect, he had a beautiful house and a family. To all appearances, he'd found his place in the world. Then Nevada decided to fight back. Chapter 3: The Black Book. Nevada's relationship with organized crime had always been complicated. On one hand, mob money had built the Strip. Everyone knew it. Everyone benefited from it. But by the mid-70s, times were changing. Corporate America was looking at Vegas, big companies with clean money and legitimate operations. They saw the profit potential. But they weren't going to invest billions if the state couldn't clean up its image problem. The Nevada Gaming Commission had a tool for dealing with undesirables. It was officially called the List of Excluded Persons. Everyone else called it the Black Book. Get your name in the Black Book, and you were banned from every casino in the state. You couldn't walk through the door, you couldn't place a bet, you couldn't even have a drink in a casino bar. If you were caught inside a casino, The property could lose its gaming license. It was a powerful weapon, but it was also risky to use. The men who ended up in the Black Book had connections. They had lawyers. They fought back. The Gaming Commission was chaired by a man named Harry Reid. Young, ambitious, not afraid of mob figures with scary reputations. Reid saw the Black Book as essential to Nevada's future. He was going to use it. Tony Spilotro was an obvious target. Everyone knew what he was. Everyone knew who he represented. The question was whether the state had the evidence and the will to put him on the list. December 7, 1978. After formal hearings and deliberations, the Nevada Gaming Commission voted. Anthony Spilotro was added to the Black Book. Banned from every casino in Nevada, statewide. For a man whose entire purpose in Vegas was to protect casino interests, this was a catastrophic development. How could he do his job if he couldn't even walk into the properties he was supposed to be protecting? Tony's lawyers appealed. They argued the decision was arbitrary, that it violated his rights, that the state hadn't proven he was currently engaged in criminal activity. The courts weren't impressed. The exclusion stood. Frank Rosenthal got the same treatment. Lefty and Tony, the two pillars of Chicago's Vegas operation, were now officially persona non grata in the industry they had been sent to manage. From Chicago's perspective, this was a disaster. But it wasn't necessarily Tony's fault. The state had made its move. There wasn't much anyone could have done to stop it. What happened next, though, that was entirely Tony's fault. Instead of laying low and finding quieter ways to operate, Tony doubled down. If he couldn't make money from the casinos directly, he'd make it elsewhere. He'd already been running side operations. Now he expanded them, aggressively. He started assembling a crew for a new venture, something more active than loan sharking or bookmaking, something that would generate serious cash and require his particular skill set. Burglary, high-end burglary, jewelry stores, wealthy homes, businesses with valuable inventory. Tony's crew would hit them hard and fast. They developed a signature method. They drilled through walls or ceilings to bypass alarm systems and locks. The hole-in-the-wall gang, the media started calling them. At first, Chicago didn't know the extent of what Tony was doing, and even if they had, they might not have cared. As long as the skim kept flowing and Tony kept the heat off the casinos, his side hustles were his business. But the heat was about to get a lot worse. Because Tony Spilotro was no longer content to operate in the shadows, he was about to become front-page news. Chapter 4. The Gang. Imagine you're a jeweler on East Sahara Boulevard in Las Vegas. It's July 4th, 1981, Independence Day. You're closed for the holiday, your inventory is locked up tight. You've got a decent alarm system, nothing to worry about. Except Tony Spilotro's crew has been watching your store for weeks. They know your security. They know your inventory. They know exactly how they're getting in. They called the place Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings. It was about to become infamous. The crew showed up in the early hours. They had drills. They had tools. They knew exactly where to penetrate the wall to bypass the alarm system. This was their specialty. This was what they'd been doing across Vegas for months. But they had a problem they didn't know about. Metro Police and the FBI had been tracking them, following them, building a case. And on this particular night, law enforcement was waiting. The burglars got inside. They started gathering merchandise. Then the doors burst open. Multiple arrests. The whole crew caught red-handed mid-heist. Tony Spilotro wasn't there personally, but his associates were. The ones he'd recruited, the ones he'd trained, the ones who could directly tie him to the operation. The hole-in-the-wall gang was blown wide open. For the FBI, this was a massive win. They'd been investigating organized crime in Vegas for years. Now they had concrete evidence, arrests, leverage, people they could flip. For Tony Spilotro, this was the beginning of the end, though he probably didn't realize it yet. The media went wild with the story. Daring burglars with a colorful nickname, ties to organized crime, a dramatic raid on a holiday weekend. It was perfect for headlines. And every headline was exactly what Chicago didn't want. Remember, Tony's entire job was to keep heat off the outfit's operations. Instead, he was generating massive amounts of attention. Federal attention, the kind that leads to indictments and informants and prosecutions. Back in Chicago, the bosses were furious. This wasn't what they'd sent Tony to Vegas for. He was supposed to be invisible. He was supposed to protect the skim. Instead, he was running a burglary ring that was now all over the news. They sent messages. Tone it down, lay low, stop drawing attention. Tony didn't listen. Or maybe he couldn't help himself. Violence and risk-taking were part of who he was. You couldn't separate the Tony who intimidated casino thieves from the Tony who ran his own burglary crew. They were the same person. The legal battles began. Tony had good lawyers. The evidence was solid, but there were still defenses to mount. Constitutional arguments to make. Witnesses to discredit. While the courts processed the hole-in-the-wall case, Tony tried to continue business as usual. He still had his crew. He still had his operations. He was still, technically, Chicago's man in Vegas, but something had shifted. The balance of power was moving. Corporate gaming companies were buying up properties. The old mob-controlled casinos were being sold off or shut down. The skim was drying up, and the scrutiny on Tony Spilotro was intensifying. Federal investigators were building multiple cases, not just for burglary, for everything: racketeering, murder, conspiracy. One of Tony's closest associates, a man named Frank Carlotta, started cooperating with authorities. Carlotta had been with Tony for years. He knew everything, where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. When a man like Frank Carlotta flips, the organization you built around him collapses. Suddenly, every crime, every operation, every violent act has a witness willing to testify. Chicago was watching all of this unfold, watching their Vegas representative become a massive liability, watching the money dry up, watching the heat intensify. They'd sent Tony to Las Vegas to protect their interests. Instead, he'd become the biggest threat to those interests, a walking indictment waiting to happen. But there were other problems too, personal problems, the kind that, in outfit culture, carried their own death sentences. Tony had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He'd started an affair with Jerry McGee, Frank Rosenthal's wife, the wife of the man he was supposed to be working alongside, the wife of a connected figure with direct ties to Chicago. It was a betrayal on every level. Professional, personal, cultural. In the world Tony came from, you could steal, you could kill, but you didn't disrespect a made man by sleeping with his wife. Chicago heard about it. Of course they heard about it. In their world, everyone knows everything eventually. The bosses were faced with a decision. Tony Spilotro had become a problem. Multiple problems, actually. The heat he was bringing, the money he was costing them, the personal betrayals, the fear that he might cooperate with authorities if the pressure got too intense. There's only one solution to that kind of problem in organized crime. In 1983, Illinois prosecutors indicted Tony for murders that had happened more than 20 years earlier. The torture killings of Billy McCarthy and James Miraglia back in 1962. The case was a mess from the start. The assigned judge, Thomas Maloney, was himself corrupt. Eventually, Maloney would go to prison for his own crimes. The prosecution against Tony fell apart. He walked. Again. Tony Spilotro seemed untouchable by the legal system. Every case against him either collapsed or resulted in minimal consequences. But there was one system he couldn't escape. One set of judges he couldn't charm, or intimidate, or outlast. The Chicago outfit had made its decision about Tony Spilotro. They just hadn't told him yet. Chapter 5. The Call. June 14th, 1986, a Saturday, Tony Spilotro and his younger brother, Michael, were in the Chicago area. Family business. Nothing unusual. Tony was still fighting his various legal battles, still operating, still convinced he could talk his way out of trouble with Chicago. still believing he was valuable enough to the organization that they wouldn't move against him. He was wrong. Michael Spilotro was younger, less connected. He'd gotten involved in some of Tony's operations, but wasn't a major player. He was there that day because he was Tony's brother, that's all. And what was about to happen? He was just collateral damage. They left Michael's home in Oak Park. The official story, the one they were told, was that there was a meeting. Important people wanted to talk. Maybe even good news. A promotion ceremony, some accounts suggest. In outfit culture, you don't refuse a call from up top. You don't question it. You show up when you're told to show up. Even if you suspect something might be wrong, you go, because not going is an admission of guilt. It's confirmation that you know you've done something wrong. Tony and Michael drove to a location in the Bensonville area. A suburban basement. Unremarkable. The kind of place nobody would remember or notice. They went inside. What happened next was brutal even by mob standards. The brothers were beaten to death, not shot. Which would have been quick, not strangled, which at least has an efficiency to it. Beaten, with fists and feet, kicked, punched, stomped. The forensic evidence would later reveal the extent of it. Extensive head trauma, neck injuries, chest injuries, internal bleeding. Both men suffered multiple blunt force injuries before they died. They were stripped down to their underwear, then their bodies were transported to Indiana, to a cornfield in Willow Slough Preserve, near a town called Enos. There, they were buried in a shallow grave, covered with dirt, left for the elements. For 8 days, nobody knew where Tony and Michael Spilotro were. They were just gone. Disappeared. In Chicago, people who knew what had happened said nothing. In Vegas, there were rumors but no facts. Law enforcement had suspicions, but no bodies. No crime scene, no evidence. June 22nd. A farmer preparing his field found something. Disturbed earth. The unmistakable outline of bodies beneath the surface. He called the police. Excavation revealed 2 bodies, male, clad only in underwear, badly decomposed after more than a week in the Indiana summer heat. Dental records confirmed what investigators suspected. Tony and Michael Spilotro, both dead since June 14. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. They'd been beaten to death and dumped like garbage. The news hit Vegas like a thunderbolt. Tony the Ant was dead. The Chicago outfit's enforcer, the man who'd terrorized the Vegas underworld for 15 years, was gone. But nobody knew who had done it. Or rather, everyone knew the Chicago outfit was responsible, but nobody could prove it. Nobody had been at that basement except the killers and the victims. And one group wasn't talking. For almost 20 years, that's how it stood. The Spilotro brothers were dead. Everyone knew the outfit had killed them, but there were no charges, no arrests, no justice. The case went cold, not because investigators gave up, but because they simply didn't have evidence. The men who'd committed the murders weren't talking. The bosses who'd ordered it weren't talking. The code of silence held. It would take a different kind of case to finally break the truth open. A case that would expose decades of outfit murders and operations. A case that would confirm exactly how and why Tony and Michael Spilotro died. That case was called Family Secrets. Chapter 6. Family Secrets. The Chicago outfit in the early 2000s was not what it had been in Tony Spilotro's day. The glory years were long gone. Corporate gaming had taken over Vegas. The skim was history. Many of the old bosses were dead or in prison. But the FBI hadn't forgotten. They'd been building a case for years. A massive racketeering case that would cover decades of outfit operations. They called it Operation Family Secrets. The goal was to charge the outfit's leadership and associates with 18 unsolved murders, including the Spilotro brothers. To do that, they needed witnesses, people from inside the organization willing to break the code of silence. In 2005, they got one. Nicholas Calabrese, an outfit hitman, a man who'd participated in numerous murders over his career. He was facing his own charges, life in prison or worse. The feds offered him a deal: cooperate, testify, tell us everything. In exchange, we'll spare your life. Calabrese took the deal. He pleaded guilty to his involvement in multiple murders. Then he started talking, and what he said filled in the blanks on decades of unsolved cases, including the Spilotro murders. Calabrese laid it out. The decision to kill Tony had come from the top. The outfit's leadership had concluded that he was too much of a liability, too much heat, too much legal exposure, too much risk that he might cooperate if the pressure got intense enough. They'd also been furious about the Jerry McGee affair, that betrayal of Frank Rosenthal, that violation of the cultural code. Tony had broken the rules, multiple rules, and in their world, there was only one consequence. The plan was set. Tony would be lured to a meeting. His brother Michael would be there too, partly as camouflage, partly because they couldn't risk leaving him alive afterward. A basement in Bensonville. Multiple outfit members waiting. When the brothers arrived, the attack began immediately. No conversation. No chance to fight back or run. Just sudden, overwhelming violence. They beat them to death. Then they took the bodies to Indiana and buried them in that cornfield. Calabrese testified to all of it. He named names. He described the planning, the execution, the disposal. For the first time, the world knew exactly what had happened to Tony and Michael Spilotro. The trial ran through 2007. The evidence was overwhelming. Calabrese's testimony, corroborating evidence, forensic details that matched the facts. The verdicts came down. Multiple outfit figures were convicted. The top tier of Chicago organized crime was decimated. Lifetimes of violence and intimidation finally caught up with them. And Tony Spilotro's murder, 21 years after the fact, was officially solved. The how, the why, the who. It didn't bring him back, obviously. It didn't undo the violence he'd committed or the lives he'd destroyed. But it closed a chapter. The last chapter of Tony Spilotro's story. Or almost the last chapter. Chapter 7. The Legacy. When you try to understand Tony Spilotro's place in history, you have to separate the man from the myth, the actual criminal from the cultural figure he became. The real Tony was a 5'2" enforcer with a violent temper and poor impulse control. He was sent to protect Chicago's interest in Vegas, and instead became the catalyst for their collapse. His robberies brought heat. His affair brought shame. His very presence in Vegas attracted exactly the kind of attention his bosses didn't want. From an organizational perspective, Tony Spilotro was a failure. He failed at the one job he'd been sent to do. Protect the skim. Keep it quiet. Keep it running. But his impact in Las Vegas was enormous, just not in the way he intended. See, Tony represented the old way of doing business. Violence, intimidation, mob control of casinos, the skim, the corruption, the bodies buried in the desert. By the 1980s, that model was dying. Corporate America wanted into Vegas. They had billions to invest. But they couldn't invest if the city still belonged to the mob. Tony Spilotro, through his spectacular failures, helped accelerate that transition. Every headline about the hole-in-the-wall gang was another argument for cleaning up Vegas. Every FBI investigation he attracted was more pressure on mob-controlled properties. The Nevada Gaming Commission's Black Book strategy, used against Tony in 1978, became the template for excluding organized crime from the industry. That tool is still in use today. It works. The corporations moved in. They bought up the old properties. They brought legitimate financing and professional management. They transformed Vegas from a mob town into a corporate entertainment destination. Would that have happened without Tony Spilotro? Probably. Eventually. But Tony's failure sped up the timeline. He made the case for change more urgent. There's also the law enforcement angle. The FBI's investigations of Tony and his crew refined their techniques for targeting organized crime. The evidence they gathered, the informants they flipped, the connections they mapped, all of that fed into broader efforts to dismantle mob operations nationwide. Tony was just one target among many, but he was a significant one, a visible one, a case study in how to take down organized crime figures through persistent investigation and strategic pressure. And then there's the cultural legacy, the mythology. Martin Scorsese's film Casino, released in 1995, introduced Tony Spilotro to a much wider audience. The character Nicky Santoro, played by Joe Pesci, was based directly on Tony. The violence, the temper, the black book, exclusion, the relationship with Rosenthal's character, the brutal death. Some of it was dramatized, some of it was compressed for narrative purposes, but the core was true. Scorsese captured something essential about Tony Spilotro, the volatility, the sense that violence was always just beneath the surface, the ultimate futility of his position. That film cemented Tony's place in popular culture. For millions of people who'd never heard of the actual Anthony Spilotro, Nicky Santoro became the archetype of the Vegas mob enforcer. There's an irony there. Tony wanted respect. He wanted power. He wanted to be remembered as someone important in the organization. He got his wish, sort of. He's remembered, but not as a success. As a cautionary tale. A case study in how not to operate. An example of what happens when ego and impulse override discipline and strategy. The Mob Museum in Las Vegas has exhibits on Tony Spilotro. They present the facts, the timeline, the crimes, the death. They contextualize him within the broader history of organized crime in Vegas. It's a fitting memorial in a way. Factual, educational, stripped of glamour, just the cold reality of what he did and what happened to him. Chapter 8. The Paradox. Here's the paradox at the heart of Tony Spilotro's story. The Chicago outfit sent him to Vegas to protect their interests, to keep the casino skim flowing, to keep federal investigators away, to maintain the status quo. Tony failed at all of that, spectacularly. His hole-in-the-wall gang brought massive media attention and federal heat. His placement in the Black Book made it impossible for him to directly access the casinos he was supposed to be protecting. His affair with Jerry McGee violated the personal codes that held the outfit together. His very presence in Vegas became a liability instead of an asset. By every measure the outfit would have used to evaluate him, Tony Spilotro was a disaster. And yet, in the moment, he probably felt successful. He had money, he had power in Vegas, he had respect from the people in his immediate circle. He was feared, he was known. Those are the things Tony valued, the outward markers of success in the criminal world. But they came at the cost of the one thing that actually mattered to his bosses: operational security. The outfit didn't want Tony to be famous. They wanted him to be effective. They wanted results without attention. They wanted the skim to flow quietly and indefinitely. What they got instead was a walking indictment. A man whose every action seemed designed to draw exactly the kind of scrutiny they'd sent him to avoid. This disconnect, this fundamental misunderstanding of what his job actually required, is what makes Tony's story so instructive. He thought he was doing well. He thought his violence and his reputation were proof of his value. He thought the outfit would tolerate his side operations and his personal indiscretions because he was too useful to lose. He was wrong about all of it. In the criminal world Tony inhabited, you only stay alive as long as you're more valuable alive than dead. The moment the calculus shifts, you're finished. For Tony, that moment came when the legal pressure intensified, when Frank Collada flipped, when the cost of protecting him started to outweigh any benefit he provided. The outfit didn't kill Tony out of anger, though they were certainly angry. They killed him as a business decision, a risk management decision. He'd become a threat to what remained of their Vegas operations and their organizational security. In their cold calculation, eliminating Tony was the smart move. It removed the liability. It sent a message to anyone else who might be thinking about cooperating with authorities. It solved multiple problems with one action. That Michael Spilotro died alongside his brother was almost incidental. Michael was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But once the decision was made about Tony, they couldn't leave Michael alive. He'd have known who did it. He'd have talked. So he died too. That's how cold the arithmetic of organized crime can be. One brother killed for being too much of a problem. The other killed for being present when the first one died. Chapter 9. The Decline of Mob Vegas. To understand Tony Spilotro's story, you have to understand the broader context. The decline of mob control over Las Vegas. The shift from organized crime to corporate gaming. In the 1950s and 60s, mob money built the Strip, the Chicago outfit, the Kansas City mob, New York families. They all had pieces of Vegas. The casinos they controlled were cash machines. But that model was fragile. It depended on secrecy, on compliant politicians, on regulators who looked the other way, on federal investigators who didn't dig too deep. By the 1970s, all of that was changing. Federal organized crime task forces were getting more aggressive. Gaming regulators were getting tougher. Politicians like Harry Reid weren't afraid to confront mob figures. The corporations were circling. They saw the profit potential in Vegas, but they needed the environment to change first. They needed the mob out. Tony Spilotro's era, the 1970s and early 80s, was a transitional period. The old mob model was dying. The new corporate model was emerging. Tony existed in the gap between them. He operated like it was still 1955, like the outfit could still control casinos through intimidation and frontmen, like the skim could go on forever. But the world had moved on. The FBI had better tools, gaming regulators had more power, corporate buyers had cleaner money and professional operations. Every year Tony was in Vegas, the ground shifted a little more beneath his feet. By the mid-80s, the casinos the outfit once controlled were being sold to corporations. The skim was drying up. The old ways were becoming impossible. Even if Tony had been perfect at his job, he probably couldn't have stopped that transition. The forces driving change were too large, too powerful, too inevitable. But Tony wasn't perfect at his job. He accelerated the very process he was supposed to be slowing down. His failures gave regulators more ammunition, more reasons to crack down, more evidence that mob influence had to be purged from Vegas. The corporatization of the Strip wasn't just about money, it was about legitimacy, about making Vegas a place where families could vacation, where conventions could be held, where mainstream America could engage without feeling like they were supporting organized crime. Tony Spilotro's Vegas was dying. The new Vegas, rising in its place, had no room for men like him. When the outfit killed Tony in 1986, they were partly acknowledging that reality. He'd become obsolete, not just troublesome, but irrelevant. The operations he'd been sent to protect no longer existed in any meaningful form. His death marked an endpoint, not just of his personal story, but of an era. The era when the mob ran Vegas, when violence and intimidation were legitimate business tools, when the skim was the real profit center. By the time the family secrets trial happened in 2007, 21 years after Tony's death, that world was ancient history. Vegas had been fully corporatized. The old mobsters were dead or dying. The casinos were owned by massive corporations with shareholders and quarterly reports. Tony Spilotro belonged to a different Vegas, a darker Vegas, a more dangerous Vegas, but also a Vegas that, for all its violence, had a certain raw authenticity. Love him or hate him, Tony was real. He wasn't a corporate brand or a marketing campaign. He was a man who believed in power and respected only strength. He lived and died by codes that made sense in his world, even if they seemed insane to everyone else. His Vegas is gone, replaced by something safer, cleaner, more profitable, but also more sterile, more calculated, less human in its way. There's no going back. And honestly, that's probably good. The violence Tony represented, the intimidation, the corruption, none of that should be romanticized. But his story remains, as a warning, as a case study, as a reminder of what Las Vegas used to be before it became what it is now. Chapter 10. The Final Account. Let's return to that basement in Bensonville. June 14th, 1986. Tony and Michael Spilotro arrive. They're told there's a meeting. Important people want to talk. They walk in unsuspecting. Or maybe Tony suspects. Maybe he's known for weeks that something was wrong, that Chicago had turned against him, that his time was running out. But what choice did he have? Run? Disappear? That would be an admission of guilt. It would paint him as a coward. In the world he came from, you face what's coming. You don't run. So he walks into that basement. And the attack begins. Multiple men, overwhelming force, no chance to fight back, no chance to talk his way out, just violence, pure and final. They strip the brothers down to their underwear, a final humiliation, a way of rendering them helpless and undignified, even in death. Then the drive to Indiana, the cornfield, the shallow grave, dirt thrown over bodies, covered and forgotten. For 8 days, Tony Spilotro ceases to exist in any official sense. He's just gone. His family doesn't know where he is. The police don't know where he is. He's in that liminal state between missing and dead. When the bodies are found, dental records confirm identity. Autopsies reveal the extent of the beating, the blunt force trauma, the internal injuries, the suffering. Tony Spilotro died hard, and he died knowing why. Because he'd failed, because he'd brought heat instead of protection, because he'd violated codes that mattered to the people who controlled his fate. His brother died for no reason except proximity. Wrong place, wrong time. Collateral damage in someone else's story. Their bodies were found. But justice took 2 decades. The Family Secrets trial in 2007 finally provided answers. Nicholas Calabrese's testimony filled in the details. The planning, the execution, the participants. Some of the men responsible were convicted. Not all, but enough. Enough to say that the system, slow as it was, eventually caught up. Tony's widow and children had to live with his legacy. The shame of it, the danger of it, the notoriety, being known as Tony the Ant's family. His brothers who'd stayed legitimate had to reckon with what Tony had become. The choices he'd made, the life he'd lived. Vegas moved on. The casinos changed hands. The Strip evolved. New hotels rose where the old mob properties had stood. The tourists kept coming, mostly unaware of the violent history beneath their feet. The Mob Museum preserves that history now. They tell Tony's story alongside dozens of others, bootleggers and bosses and enforcers and informants. The whole bloody tapestry of American organized crime. Tony's exhibit presents the facts without judgment. This is what he did. This is how he died. This is why it mattered. For historians and crime researchers, Tony Spilotro is an important case study, an example of how organized crime operated in Vegas, how enforcement worked, how the relationship between mob bosses and their representatives in the field could break down. For film fans, he's Nicky Santoro, Joe Pesci's manic energy and violence, the pen scene, the desert, the stylized brutality. For Vegas old-timers, he's a memory, part of the city's rough past. A reminder of when things were different, when power came from fear instead of quarterly earnings. And for Chicago, he's a footnote in the outfit's long decline. One of many soldiers who lived hard and died violently. Not special, not unique, just another cautionary tale. Tony Spilotro wanted to be remembered. He wanted respect. He wanted his name to mean something. He got all of that, just not the way he imagined. His name does mean something. It means failure, miscalculation, the cost of ego in a world that demands discipline. It means the end of an era, the death of Mob Vegas, the rise of corporate control. It means violence without purpose, brutality without strategy, A life lived intensely and ended abruptly. Tony the Ant, 5'2", shadow longer than his frame. The man Chicago sent to protect their Vegas empire, who instead became the spark that burned it down. His story ends in an Indiana cornfield, but it begins in Patsy's restaurant on Grand Avenue, a boy serving pasta to mobsters, learning the lessons that would define his life and seal his fate. Every choice he made afterward led to that basement. Every act of violence, every betrayal, every moment of pride and ego. The Chicago outfit thought they were sending an enforcer to Vegas. What they sent instead was a lit fuse. Tony Spilotro didn't protect their interests. He exposed them. He made their operations impossible to maintain. And when they killed him for it, they were partly killing the old model itself. The belief that violence alone could control a city, that intimidation could substitute for strategy, that one man with enough brutality could hold back the tide of change. Tony couldn't. Nobody could. Vegas was always going to evolve past the mob model. Corporate money and regulatory pressure were always going to win eventually. But Tony's spectacular failure accelerated the process. His story became the argument for why things had to change. In that sense, his life had meaning, just the opposite meaning from what he intended. He wanted to be the man who kept the mob in power. Instead, he became the man whose failures helped end their reign. That's the final irony of Tony Spilotro's life. He succeeded at failing. He became famous for being a disaster. He changed Vegas by being exactly wrong for what the moment required. The ant who thought he was building, who thought he was protecting, who thought he was serving his boss's interests, when all along he was tearing down, exposing, destroying, not intentionally, not strategically, just through the natural expression of who he was and what he valued: violence, power, respect, money, reputation, all the things that mattered in his world, none of the things that would have let him survive in it. That's the story of Tony Spilotro, not a villain from central casting, not a cartoon mobster, but a real man with real strengths and catastrophic weaknesses. A man who helped end an era by being exactly what that era had created, and exactly what it could no longer sustain. His name is in the Black Book, his story is in the museums, his crimes are in the court records, his death is in the history books, and his legacy is written in the corporate towers of the Las Vegas Strip. The world that rose where his world fell. Different, cleaner, safer, but built on the same ground, the same desert, the same city that Tony the Ant tried to control and couldn't, the city that outlived him, that forgot him, that moved on. Las Vegas always moves on. It's what the city does best. New hotels replace old ones, new stories replace old ones, new legends replace the legends that came before. Tony Spilotro is part of the old Vegas now, the Vegas that existed before corporate sanitization, the Vegas that was dangerous and real and brutal. That Vegas is gone. Tony made sure of it, through his failures, through his pride, through his inability to be what the moment required. He's buried in Illinois, near Chicago, near the world that created him, the world he tried to export to Nevada and couldn't. His grave is quiet, private, away from the neon and the noise and the endless churn of the Strip, far from the cornfield in Indiana where he lay for 8 days, far from the basement in Bensonville where he died, far from the casinos he was sent to protect and couldn't, far from Vegas, the city that used him up and spit him out, the city that took what he offered and then destroyed him for offering it. That's where the story ends, with a quiet grave in Illinois, with court records and museum exhibits, with a movie character who bears his name and captures his essence, with the knowledge that Tony Spilotro, for all his violence and reputation, was ultimately just another man who thought he was bigger than forces he couldn't understand or control. He wasn't. Nobody is. The outfit couldn't stop Vegas from changing. Tony couldn't protect the skim. The old ways couldn't survive contact with corporate money and federal pressure. Change was coming regardless. Tony just became the face of why it was necessary. The ant who broke the dam, the enforcer who proved enforcement wasn't enough. The man who showed Chicago that their Vegas empire was finished. That's Tony Spilotro's legacy. Not what he built, but what his failures helped tear down. Not what he protected, but what his presence made impossible to protect. Not the hero of his own story, but a cautionary character in someone else's. Las Vegas's story. The story of organized crime's decline. The story of corporate ascension. The story of how one man's spectacular failures became the argument for a new way of doing business. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what remains when all the violence and the headlines and the drama fade into history. A name, a warning, a reminder of what Vegas used to be. And the closed chapter in the book of American organized crime. Tony the Ant, dead at 48, buried at 33, found after 8 days, solved after 21 years. Gone, but not forgotten, because his story matters, not for what he accomplished, but for what his failures revealed. About power, about change, about the futility of trying to hold back progress through intimidation alone. Las Vegas. Learned that lesson. The outfit learned it too late. Tony Spilotro never learned it at all, and that's why he died in a basement in Bensonville, why he was buried in a cornfield, why his empire collapsed before he did, because he couldn't see what was obvious to everyone else, that his time was over, that his methods were obsolete, that his presence was poison to the very interests he'd been sent to protect. He died believing he still mattered, still believing he was valuable, still believing he could talk his way out of trouble. He was wrong. The end came fast, brutal, final, and Vegas moved on without him, because Vegas always moves on. That's the story of Tony Spilotro, the ant who brought down the mob's Vegas empire, not through betrayal, not through cooperation with authorities, but through sheer incompetence at the one job he'd been sent to do, protect the interests of the Chicago outfit in Las Vegas. He failed, spectacularly, catastrophically, completely, and in failing, he changed everything.